So welcome everyone to today's guest speaker program of the U.S. Asia Law Institute at NYU School of Law. I'm the executive director, Catherine Wilhelm, and I'm especially happy to host this program today because the topic, the value of U.S. China education exchanges, is such an important and critical one for our own institute. As many of you will know, our mission has been to bridge gaps to foster understanding between the United States and Asia, chiefly through education and scholarship. And personally, I've been involved in what we call P2P, people-to-people exchanges between US and China for quite a while now. So both professionally and personally, I'm really happy to have this conversation about where we are in these kinds of exchanges and where we're going, and why it is that so many of us do value these kinds of contacts. So it's wonderful to have with us two persons who have been for a long time important figures in the U.S. China education firmament, Ambassador Julia Chang Bloch and Rosie Levine. I'm just going to give a few snippets from their bios because they've accomplished quite a bit and the details are on our website. But Ambassador Bloch has founded two nonprofits, the F.Y. Chang Foundation and the U.S. China Education Trust, or USCET. The foundation honors her father, F.Y. Chang, who was in the very first cohort of Chinese students who came to study at Harvard Law School. And the foundation supports Chinese students to come today to study at Harvard Law. Whereas USCET is quite different, and it partners with Chinese universities to promote American studies and to hold conferences, exchanges, seminars, various programs about topics in education and in US-China engagement. Ambassador Bloch spent 25 years in government service, culminating as US Ambassador to Nepal. And then she's had a very busy second career in the private, for-profit and nonprofit sectors. Rosie Levine is executive director of USCET, and she herself is a product of education exchange. She has degrees from Peking University and the University of Michigan, and spent part of her childhood growing up in Beijing, and has been, in the last few years, especially since COVID, has been a real leader in efforts amongst people working in education and also P2P to restart and to support these kinds of exchanges, starting from everything plunged to more or less zero during COVID, so try to restart them and keep them going. So as I say, you can find more on our website and also at their website. But I wanted to begin because I know some people will be very familiar with USCET, others will not know about it, just to kind of set the scene for the conversation by asking about what USCET does. It has a unique model of education exchange. It's not bringing Chinese students over en masse to attend US colleges and universities. So Julia, could you explain for us what does USCET do and when did it begin?
Catherine, thank you, and good morning. First, though, let me thank the U.S. Asia Law Institute and you for inviting my colleague Rosie Levine and me to share the stage today. You know that Rosie and I are separated by 50 years, two full generations. And yes, I'm that old and she is that young. While we represent two very different eras of education exchange, we work in one organization for one purpose, to carry forward the same mission. Use the power of exchange to build mutual understanding, like your institute, between the US and China, needed now more than ever. So now, back to your question. When people hear education exchange, they think of students going back and forth. I do. But I was a Peace Corps volunteer teaching English in a remote Chinese middle school in Sabah, Malaysia. That was back in 1964 and 66. There I learned firsthand that education is far more than book learning. I made sure that my students passed their junior Cambridge examinations, but I also organized many clubs and activities, taking my students on their first plane ride, giving them their first boat ride, uh, taking them to a foreign country for the first time, getting them to meet the chief minister in the capital city, and having socials where they can actually practice English. So when I returned to Sabah some 20 years later, they did not talk about their classes or passing the exams, but they well remembered, what do you think? All the activities we had outside the classroom, especially the trips. They also told me that the time they spent with me helped open their eyes and their minds, helped them see new possibilities, and expanded their horizons. I really couldn't ask for more. So, the U.S. China Education Trust, which I founded in 1998, embodies what my Peace Corps experience taught me. I founded USCET with the idea of promoting education exchange, but also creating ongoing intellectual exchange between American and Chinese students, as well as scholars, educators, and thought leaders. We're not a school. We can't be a school. USCET operates as a catalyst and connector, facilitating relationships and resources that enable Chinese institutions working in partnership with us to develop their own programs focused on understanding America. I think I should stop here and let Rosie chime in and tell us her thoughts on a broader education exchange vision.
Well, thank you, Julia. Thank you, Catherine and Usali for inviting us. It's really great to have this format. I remember joining your lunches, the Usali lunches in person in New York when I was living there, and I'm delighted to see the attendees. You're continuing to get a robust cross-section of the field, and it's really wonderful to be here. So I think just following on what Julia kind of outlined, Julia and I do represent very different moments in, different generations, different moments in U.S.-China relations. But we do share this kind of vision of how education has been and can continue to be a bridge between the two sides. As you mentioned in your bio of me, my own background spans both countries. I grew up in China, and that really, for me, kind of sparked my interest in this type of work, and I think really does inform how the vision I see of the role USET fills in this space. When I moved back from living in Beijing to outside of Boston, suburban Massachusetts, all my classmates had just completed their China course in world history the year before. And so um, when I arrived, I was surrounded by classmates who thought they knew China, right? Who thought they understood this place, thought it was, they understood what was going on. But as somebody who had spent time on the ground, it was extremely different than of course, what they had learned in the classroom. Um, the nuance, the texture, the diversity, just the way things work isn't captured in classroom learning. And I think that for me was a very early lesson and something that I think has really motivated my own journey through the field, trying to find these opportunities and ways to bring that firsthand engagement between Chinese and the United States, individuals who seek to better understand each other. And so USIT's work, as you mentioned, doesn't really bring students here and there. We don't do the kind of things that some of these big study abroad companies or education providers offer. But we do seek to seed the field and be a catalyst for those who are doing it. How do we make the conditions better? How do we understand what's going on? How do we leverage resources that we have or that exist and get those in the hands of those who can use them? And as you mentioned at the top, Catherine, it's a tough moment for education exchange. Both sides, the numbers have been going down, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. So I think that's a renewed challenge for an organization like us. We're very small, and we seek to do a lot with kind of leveraging other players. So we're thinking about not only how do we get better information about American studies in the United States to China, but really the inverse as well, with really low numbers of Americans studying in China. What can we do to spark that interest, to create those pathways where they still exist and get more firsthand exposure on both sides?
I think I should now jump back in because I think I need to share with you how I developed this different approach to education exchange for USCET. It goes back to when I concluded my time as ambassador in Nepal. I was looking at the next phase of my career and conducted extensive informational meetings with think tanks and organizations with an interest in Asia. What I discovered then was that virtually every entity that I met with was engaged in educating Americans about Asia and China, but almost no one was focused on the inverse, helping Asians and the Chinese particularly understand America. I thought to myself that USCET could or might be able to fill this niche, although USCET was not quite clear yet in my mind then. The conventional wisdom at that time was that the Chinese understood America far better than Americans understood China. When I took up Peking University's invitation in 1998 to celebrate their centennial and help revive their Center for American Studies, I discovered that even their top America experts focused primarily on U.S. China relations and current events. That's what their leaders were interested in. But they knew little about American society, culture, and politics. How can you understand what drives American foreign policy and when you don't understand the domestic issues in America? When I discussed this with prominent Chinese scholars, many of them actually agreed with me privately. They also explained that American studies in China was not yet an academic discipline and could not, by any means, compare with the China area studies programs often found at top U.S. universities, which offered comprehensive curricula in Chinese language, history, politics, economics, culture, and so on. Now, before I let Rosie talk about our current needs, the current needs, let me just add one note. There is one area where the Chinese really outshine Americans, and I think you know what it is. It's by far their language capability. Most Chinese American experts speak English flawlessly, whereas their American counterparts, by and large, are monolingual, barely getting by in spoken Chinese. So that's how I began to conceptualize what U.S. China Education Trust, what USCET should be doing, not following the traditional mode.
Yeah, well, and then just to bring that back to today, and I think you have another question for us, Catherine. But I think we're in a very different situation in U.S.-China relations, and that's where I think our mission has been evolving as we think about the new realities. In 1998, there was a real lack of American studies in China. And that question, I think, that motivated Julia is still one that's important today. How do we ensure that both sides, especially, the Chinese, better understand the factors that go into American foreign policy making? And that's a question I think anyone who engages with China gets asked by their Chinese counterparts. The understanding of the domestic concerns and the average American viewpoint are still very poorly, I think, understood. And yet the same is true on the other side, and I think maybe more acutely now, given how few Americans are getting a chance to spend time in China and really see beyond the government stance. And so as we look today at the real kind of pipeline narrowing for Americans coming to, going to China, Chinese coming here, the low numbers of students on both sides, I think on USCET, expanding Julia's mission and trying to find ways to get that nuance and depth and texture in both countries is really a priority for us.
So I'd just like to quickly then summarize what USCET actually has been doing, because we've talked a bit about a model, but haven't really spelled it out too much. So as I understand it, and you can both correct me if I've got something wrong, that you set up a network of Chinese universities, and it's called the American Studies Network. And these universities participate in activities that are organized by USCET, right? Then you bring over American Studies experts from the US to China for periodic conferences and discussions, and that this is what helps to feed new information and contacts, and just all kinds of intellectual resources to the Chinese universities that participate in the network. Have I got that right?
Yeah, that's precisely right. And the model is really founded on this network kind of that was really built by hand by Julia, institution by institution, that represents all types of institutions within China, the well-funded, well-resourced coastal schools, and the more modest, quieter inland schools with less resources and less access to the, foreign expertise on, just the outside world in general. And the way that the model works is also to bring in real Americans to talk about American studies. In China, like any place, there's a lot of domestic discourse and a very robust, field and sets of debates that can sometimes really differ from the experiences of how Americans would kind of characterize or understand their own history or events. And so being able to hold this conference in English, bring in vetted and unbiased opinions from America to come to join the conversation, expose Chinese academic institutions and scholars to the various views within the field here in the United States, and then really network and leverage that network. So getting the folks who study America in China together and breaking out of the silos of their own campus, their own institutions, their own priorities or disciplinary kind of subset, and getting to meet each other and build a broader kind of community of folks who are interested in the United States within China.
You know, the story of how American Studies became the core, certainly at the beginning, of USCET's programming and USCET's mission, it really came from Peking University. As I mentioned earlier, I was invited by them to celebrate their centennial with them in 1998. But when I accepted the invitation, I thought it was just going to be fun, right? Well, they asked me to revitalize their Center for American Studies. I was shocked. I mean, why me? I'm not a scholar. I'm not an American Studies expert. My Chinese was laughable then. So I said to them, I can't possibly teach in Chinese. And they said to me, they said, why would Peking University want someone to teach in Chinese? We have plenty of professors. So what happened was being on the ground made all the difference in developing USCET's working approach in China. My first introduction to the American Studies Center at PKU confirmed, without a doubt, that Americans in China needed help. At PKU, it's known as the Harvard of China. Its American Studies Center in 1998 was located in one room, shared, if I remember correctly, with the centers of Russia, Australia, and Canada, I think. Its books were meager, and the journals were few and outdated. I conceived USCET really almost right there on the campus of PKU, which would later become USCET's calling. And they made me the executive chair, vice chair of the American Studies Center. And through all the networks and people that I met through that position, the American Studies Network would come into being. And my residencies at Peking University and at Fudan University in Shanghai from 1998 to about 2003 actually brought me face to face with deep-seated Chinese misperceptions of the United States. I'll try to keep this short. Those experiences were invaluable in shaping USCET's program strategy. PKU gave me a clear sense of the importance of American studies and the need to create space for Chinese scholars to broaden their research beyond a focus on U.S. China relations and U.S. foreign policy. Establishing the ASN, USCET embedded the study of American culture and society into the academic landscape in China, leading to the Ministry of Education listing area studies in September of 2022 as an interdisciplinary field of study for the first time, with American studies as its biggest subfield. And I should really talk to you about Fudan, because there it was different. I was in the right place at the right time. Those of you old enough, you remember that Jiang Zemin was president of China at the time. I just remembered how young Rosie was then. And I have to marvel at that. She was barely out of being a toddler. Anyways, he was unhappy. Jiang Zemin was unhappy with how the WTO negotiations were going, and had asked Fudan to help train China's diplomats to better understand the U.S. Congress. I had seen a similar need, not so much about the WTO negotiations, but generally. And when I arrived at Fudan, I had a congressional studies proposal in my pocket, because PKU, I realized, was unlikely to take it on. In just one day, never has anything happened so quickly in China for me. In just one day, the program was approved, faculty assigned, and China's first congressional studies program was launched at Fudan.
So if
And
I may interject just briefly, for those who
sure,
don't know, Fudan is a major Chinese university in Shanghai. And then President Jiang Zemin was from Shanghai. He had been the former leader of Shanghai. But when you say, Julia, when you say a congressional studies program, what do you mean? You mean a program to study the U.S. Congress?
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And you're in New York, and my partner, the professor they assigned to be my partner, our counterpart in this, was Professor Sunza from Fudan. I think some of you may know him. And you were just perfect. I was just about to tell you a little bit about Fudan, because most people have heard of Peking University, but perhaps not everyone has heard of Fudan. Well, as you mentioned, Jiang Zemin was from Shanghai. His inner circle was from Shanghai, and he used Fudan as his brain trust. So this initiative that we started, this congressional studies program, gave Chinese scholars, students, and officials a clear understanding of U.S. politics and a system of separation of powers, countering the then very common Chinese misperception that criticism of China by members of Congress, that was many then, did not really mean it was White House or USG policy. And this course would deepen Chinese interest in the study of American governance. And beginning in 2000 at Fudan, USCET, partnering with the American University's Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies, will bring every U.S. presidential and midterm election sense into China's classrooms, research institutes, and think tanks, and even boardrooms. So together, these initiatives help to build a more accurate, nuanced, and fact-based understanding of the United States and China. And I don't know if, Rosie, you would agree with me.
Yeah, well, I'll just note very briefly that the American Studies Network persists to today, as does the Congressional Studies work. There's still, I think, a lot of interest in China in getting a more a deeper and more robust understanding of the United States outside of U.S. China relations, really how America works on its terms. And it's also still a very, it's a need, right? I think we continue to see how misperceptions between the United States and China inform the ways in which we continue to, not get along and find challenges in our negotiations and our geopolitical relations and even in our people-to-people engagements. And so the need is still there. And I think, as Julia outlined, that really kind of demonstrates USET's model, which is bringing, kind of firsthand expertise and deep understanding to the other side. And we do that through the American Studies Network, but our programs are broader than that as well. We do programs here in the United States that bring U.S. and Chinese students together for dialogue on issues of common concern, getting the chance for Gen Z to get to know each other online, if not in person, when travel is much more difficult these days. We have a long running or a monthly program here in Washington, a public facing program trying to bring Americans with firsthand understanding of China to inspire the next generation of American specialists on China to better understand what a career and pathway in the field might look like. And when Chinese delegations and groups are here in the United States, we leverage that opportunity as well and provide opportunities for firsthand dialogue and opportunities for people who might not get to engage with Chinese perspectives firsthand, the chance to hear how scholars and experts within the system think about the United States today. So we really work at the intersection of the scholarly communities on both sides.
So the kind of firsthand conversations that you're describing, whether it's experts, Americans like yourselves, but also the scholars whom you bring to China to engage directly with Chinese professors and their students there, to overcome, as you say, misperceptions that may exist from people who have only learned about another country through books. That kind of firsthand exchange taking place in China is in a sense mimicked or occurs in reverse when Chinese come out to the United States. So now they may be at a regular American college program, undergrad or graduate school, but they also have that chance through their immersion in in being in America and in college classrooms to clarify all kinds of things that they may have misunderstood. But this was not, you were not, certainly originally, and even now, you're not engaged in trying to recruit these students, to bring them over, or anything like that. Do you find that kind of exchange of, Chinese coming over to the United States and learning in classrooms, is it as effective in helping Chinese students to understand America and to clear up misconceptions? Or is it possible that Chinese students would come over here and then return still not understanding America? Because there's one stereotype that Chinese students are a bit clannish and keep to themselves and don't mix with other students. Does that happen?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it certainly does happen, but I think the question is that does that prevent, the ability to learn? And I would say no. I think that the exposure and the firsthand understanding is key in itself, at least even to kind of show what you don't know, right? It's hard to know what you don't know when you sit and read, the news back in Beijing or whatever, wherever you might be. But when you're confronted with different viewpoints and perspectives here in the United States, I think that does spark an interest in more engagement and connectivity, even if, those students who are coming here aren't studying America, they're studying, whatever sector they've chosen, whether it's engineering or computer science. The exposure itself, I think, is a key piece of that puzzle. But I will also note the numbers of Chinese students are going down, and I think we've seen that trend taking place. There was a kind of high watermark in 2019 where there were 350,000 Chinese students in the United States. It's, COVID happened right after that, but the trend is still going downwards. There's about 270,000 Chinese students now in the United States as of last academic year. We don't have figures yet on this year, but I'm sure with visa policies and everything else going on in U.S. China relations and U.S. domestic politics, we will continue to see a decline. And so I think the question is like, as those numbers decrease, what impact that will have on understanding of America within the Chinese system.
Yeah.
I don't want to mislead anyone here. The reason why USCET doesn't do the usual exchange of students back and forth is not because we don't think it's important. It's because we don't have the resources to pay for all of that. And I would say that actually immersion in a culture is absolutely essential to developing mutual understanding. Um, because I would say that knowledge alone is not sufficient to build understanding, especially mutual understanding. Now, you could have a bad experience and you could go back, uh, less understanding of a culture or less admiring of a culture. But, there's no guarantees in life. But in doing this exchange business, you need to develop empathy, the ability to stand in another's shoes, to see the world through their eyes. Combine knowledge and empathy together can create strategic understanding. I see that as a kind of power and a critical national security asset in navigating U.S. China relations that avoids miscalculations. So, as I see it, empathy does not come easily from books. I think we share that thought. It comes from personal interaction and people to people exchange and immersion in another culture and society.
What kind of impacts can you cite? And I'm sure you do cite when you, for example, write your annual reports and talk about what you've done over the past year. You probably usually have a few things that you point to in any given year of how you see the concrete effects and impacts of your programming. Could you just maybe tell us about one or two?
Sure, sure. The most concrete example of USET's impact on American studies at Chinese universities is probably the first all-university interdisciplinary American Studies survey course titled American Culture and Society that I launched at Beida in 1999 with the support of a Fulbright professor. He brought the academic expertise. By 2000, this university-wide elective, co-taught by 15, and I say 15 PKU professors, was already drawing 350 plus students per class. It was taught every spring, including from neighboring Tsinghua University. It was an elective, and all non-humanities, social sciences students had to take an elective, or at least one. And many of them chose this one. I still remember going from dean to sign up their departments to participate because I wanted an interdisciplinary course. And once I got a vice president of the university who studied at Stanford to teach the education component of the course, it was smooth sailing. Other departments realized it had the blessing of the university leadership. And so to this day, the course continues to be one of PKU's most popular electives, drawing large enrollments and bringing together faculty from multiple disciplines. This course has also played an important role in strengthening American studies in China by providing students with a broad introduction to U.S. history, politics, law, literature, culture, society, and so on. But I think we should hear about other examples. I will turn to Rosie right now to tell, I think, our favorite story about the power of educational exchange and its impact. Then I will give you two more examples because I want to cut this up so that we have a different voice here. So Rosie, tell them about Xiaofan.
Sure, sure. Well, first I will say also, just in addition thinking about impact, I think another important piece that we can point to in recent years is just last year we went back for the first American Studies Network conference since the pandemic. We had been holding conferences virtually online that had been successful, but I think as many on this call understand, there's really a difference with in-person convening. And yet it was a long time since we'd been in China. The regulations had changed, the processes had become more complicated, the bureaucracy had strengthened. Holding an international conference in China right now is frankly very difficult. Um, and yet we worked with partners who we've built relationships with over many, many years, and took the time, the 6 months or so of getting all of the approvals through, and we got, in the end, we got the approvals to hold this conference, and I believe it was the first English language kind of international conference held at BY since the pandemic. And we had nothing but positive experiences when we were there. And it was, I think, a real testament to the interest and desire to still kind of hold this kind of, convenings and have this international type of engagement, even within this climate, even when it's very challenging on both sides to get the approvals and to get this through. So I think that's one example we can certainly point to as a success. And that conference itself was oversubscribed. We had a high, one of the highest levels of registration that we've ever had, and a really robust conversation with, all sorts of dynamics. It was right on the eve of the election. So of course, US politics were high on everyone's mind, but literature, art, culture, and just a diversity of different subsects within American studies were represented. So that's, I think, another piece we can cite. But as Julia knows, there's, I think, a really powerful example of how this work has actually really kind of manifest. When Julia arrived on campus in Beida in 1998, the junior research assistant assigned to her to support her in her work was Fan Sherming, who was then a professor, a junior master's student, I think, or PhD student at Beida. Um, he got involved with her work and the work on American studies. He was already focused in American studies, but through the work that Julia had established, there was, this kind of bigger pathway of experiences that and opportunities to study America. And fast forward however many years into the future, he was my dean at Yenching Academy at Beida when I studied there. And so, and then, through that role is cultivating the next generation of both Chinese and Americans who want to better understand each other's sides and are interested in global engagement. So, there's the kind of keeping these pathways open and creating the formats for the engagement, but really there's also the direct impact of getting people who are interested in these in this endeavor the resources to be able to be successful, and that has knock-on effects and from there.
And you might mention that we're partnering with him. I mean, he's now all grown up, right? So he's in the position, we're partnering with him on a very important project. And it's your project.
Could I ask, this tees up something I've been wondering. Do you come across either diplomats, Chinese diplomats, or Chinese government officials in whatever roles or departments who did study, either studied in the United States or went through American studies programs, and whose understanding of the United States strikes you as being somewhat more accurate or more nuanced than sort of the average?
I mean, I think all the time it's been such an incredible, I think, resource, strategic resource in the United States of Chinese who've studied in this country and who understand America better for that very fact, and can pull, exactly as Julia mentioned, on the strategic empathy and the ability to put themselves in others' shoes to understand how decision making in the United States is coming into being. And I think that we really I think in the United States, we risk undermining that asset that we have. We've had the benefit of soft power, but also of, exposure that has really, I think, benefited and strengthened both sides of the relationship, but primarily on the Chinese side, where so many more have come than on the inverse. That I think really, as Julia noted, might, could really set us back in terms of our ability to understand or potentially misunderstand each other, miscalculate, and risk, escalation. And I think, likening back to the Cold War, I mean, it's an interesting contrast where between then and now, we were in this, strategic competition mindset, and we're looking at the ways in which we may or may not get along with a peer power. But at that time, there was a deep, deep investment, at least on the United States side, in sending Americans to the Soviet Union to better understand the country, to get firsthand exposure, to, speak the language, to get to know counterparts, and to use that as a resource to help us be more informed and better, aware and how to compete. And the same was true on the other side. The Soviets sent a number of their top America specialists here to better understand what was going on because they felt it was in their strategic interest. Even in the early days of the U.S. China relationship, we had a similar mentality with the CSC PRC, the Committee for Scholarly Communication with the People's Republic of China. It was an academic endeavor, but it was condoned and approved and pushed forward by the highest levels from Kissinger and Nixon themselves to try to ensure that Americans had that firsthand exposure. And I think the same is true on the Chinese side. They were deeply interested in understanding for their own interests how the United States works. So I think we've had different points where we've used that understanding in I think a bit of a more functional way, I guess. And it seems like that's really not in the vogue now. But I think there is this misperception that mutual understanding is not condoning what the other side is doing or thinking everything they do is right. Knowledge is power at the end of the day, and I think that that there's kind of this vision that like somehow if you understand someone that means that you have to agree, and I don't think that's an accurate perception. I think that kind of holds back where we're at right now.
Mm.
Well,
So
Catherine, if you are looking for specific names, there have been many, by the way, but I refer you to Terry Lautz's book. And Rosie, what was the name of the book? Do you remember?
Chinese Encounters with America. It just came.
Aha. And there's one example from there that I can share with everybody now, and that is Ji Caozu. He was sent to America as a boy and attended Harvard University. He became a key interpreter for the top Chinese leaders, including Chairman Mao Zedong and Premier Zhou Enlai. He interpreted for Nixon's historic 1972 trip to China and the negotiations that led to the Shanghai Communique, a major step toward normalizing diplomatic relations between the U.S. and China. You can imagine how much his America background helped with his job. But there are many examples like this. I don't think that we have the time right now to go over them, but we could, again, certainly share more with you. But do look up Terry Lautz's book.
It's fantastic.
Yeah. So just to bring it up to where we are now, and you've gotten us largely there, Rosie. You're in a completely changed geopolitical environment from 1998 when, as Julia was saying, President Jiang Zemin himself was in favor of boosting education exchanges and in boosting American studies in China. And certainly on the US side, everything was green lights all the way. Now both governments have concerns about education exchanges. It's not just coming from the US, it's also on the Chinese side. The Chinese students have reported, well, we've also seen some official documents to this effect, that certain jobs in China are no longer open to returned Chinese who have studied in the United States, or for that matter, other countries. So some jobs become off limits to them when they go back home. There's all kinds of criticisms that the students who go abroad, it runs the whole gamut, that the Chinese critics in China say that their own students who go abroad are not the best ones because the best ones would get into the top Chinese schools, or the ones who go abroad are not, quote, loyal because why would they go abroad? Or if they go abroad and they get into a prestigious school and complete a prestigious program and then they come back, then they're somehow failures because if they were really good, they would have been able to get a job abroad. And of course, some of these suspicions and critiques are mutually contradictory, but they exist, right? This is what we see, and it even is to the point where during the summer, the People's Daily ran a commentary in where they were actually trying to refute or respond to some of these kinds of critiques of Chinese students who had come back from abroad and why they should not be under suspicion as being disloyal or incompetent or frauds or whatever, whatever the particular epithet. So that's on the Chinese side. On the US side, of course, as I think most of our audience knows well, there is a sense that Chinese students are taking the seats that, so the more Chinese or other foreign students there are, not just Chinese, the fewer seats there are for Americans. And also they might all be spies.
Yeah.
Kind of, I think, sums up the two main critiques. And this is really, I think it's safe to say, a byproduct of the larger geopolitical concerns. It's not that education is really the focal point, but it's suffering the fallout. So for you and others in this sector, how do you respond to these kinds of critiques? Do you have opportunities to talk to officials in either government or both governments? What can you say?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. And I will, to state the obvious at the top, the people who suffer the most are the students on both sides who, for whatever, decision they've chosen, have somehow to, deal with the consequences, whether it's accusations of loyalty questions or their motives or whatever it might be on both sides. So it is really a shame that that's the kind of the real byproduct is hurting, I think, precisely the wrong people. But I think it's a really important question, and I think you're precisely right. I think zooming out, the politicization of education exchange mirrors the bigger trends within the U.S.-China relationship. I don't think it's the root, but it's certainly a byproduct and maybe a knock-on effect. But as China has risen and the United States and China have shifted their relationship with each other, it's a very different moment than 1998, where China was seen as the weaker partner, and there was a lot more of this, maybe generosity, soft power. It was a kind of a up to down relationship rather than being seen as peer, equals. And I think that really shaped the landscape, wrongly, but I think at that time was the mentality was much more in the missionary mindset of education in China, and that kind of vision of the United States as maybe a benefactor. And I think as China has risen and the landscape has changed geopolitically, the also the political environment under China under Xi Jinping, and the increased suspicion of engagement with the United States, and in the United States increased suspicion of China for a lot of our reasons that I think are familiar to everyone on this call. I mean, we're really looking at an entirely different ecosystem of education opportunities. And I think one really, challenge and complicated piece of this is that there is a dynamic that exists that under Xi Jinping, under this, kind of policy in China, some students and parts of the diaspora community are used as leverage, and are used to try to gather information. And it's difficult because I think it seems that there's this challenge where in the fact that students have been instrumentalized has now cast suspicion on the entire endeavor of students in the United States, when really it's only it is a problem, but it's not the only problem. It's not the only issue, right? And so I think there hasn't really been this this kind of corrective lens, or this kind of shift of what are we losing if we politicize the entire endeavor of education exchange with China, in terms of recasting it in the U.S. interest. And so I think there's this kind of pure dynamic at place where the openness that once existed is now seen as a liability on both sides. And so that I've spoken a little bit about the U.S. suspicion towards Chinese students. Similar dynamic on the Chinese side, the idea that openness and coming to the United States for academic opportunities and to come and attend the best colleges and universities in the world would be a career boost and something that would improve your academic and professional outcomes when you return to China, has really been replaced with suspicion that there's ideological openness of the United States has polluted the mentality, and that they're going to bring back these ideas to China. And so it's really kind of inverted the entire model. And all that to say is, I think that's really changed how we do our work. I personally do not expect that education exchange is going to be an apolitical issue in the near term. I think it will continue to remain politicized because it is seen as this, if not the front line, this kind of touch point of all these other bigger dynamics in US-China relations. So for us, I think it's really looking at what does the future look like? If it's not going to be unconstrained, open, easy education exchange in the years ahead, what can we do? What is worth preserving? How do we carve out what issues are, like critical technology issues that will be extremely difficult and, need to be solved, but are the kind of really thorny kind of center of the US-China competition? And how do we set those aside from the ordinary, regular, non-securitized student issues that are, we hope to see continue in a much less constrained way, even amid a changed bilateral relationship.
I think I would just add one thing. I think the Thucydides trap history might be at play here. I agree things are not going to get better before they get worse, actually. Harvard professor Graham Allison wrote a book about it. Throughout history, it happened 16 times when a rising power challenged the ruling power. And in a dozen times, or 12 times, they went to war. The question we're facing is really bigger than education exchange. The question is whether America and China can escape this trap and avoid war. And I think that's where Rosie left us as well. It's a sobering thought. Catherine, back to you.
Okay. Well, I wanted at this point to try to bring in some of the audience. We've had a few questions posted already in the
Okay, but Catherine, let me interrupt. I haven't yet. You gave me a chance to promote USCET, to praise USCET, and I didn't do that yet. Remember?
Oh,
So let me give you the two examples that I said that I would cite for you. I mean, how can I turn down this chance, huh, Rosie? Don't you agree with me?
okay.
Okay. I always think that it's best to hear from what others have to say about your accomplishments.
Okay.
And as I said, I will cite one Chinese professor and one American professor. Professor Meidern Yi of Beijing Foreign Studies University, who many consider as the informal dean of American studies in China. He did not miss one ASN conference, and he has spawned several generations of Chinese America experts. I think, Catherine, you know him. Anyway, he said this at the 15th anniversary of the ASN conference in 2019, which was held at BFSU. The ASN, and I quote him, has Chinese academia's continuing support because USCET did not come to China to preach or tell the Chinese how to think or what to do. Instead, USCET created an open platform in which scholars of American studies of all disciplines could meet, share research, and engage in meaningful and impartial exchange in the interest of promoting mutual understanding. Now I turn to the American professor, Shelley Fisher-Fishkin, then president of the American Studies Association. She's a professor at Stanford, keynoted the first ASN conference hosted by Fudan University in 2004. We then invited her to keynote the ASN's 2018 conference in Shanghai, but at East China Normal University, not Fudan. There she said, USCET's impact on the field of transnational American studies has been deep as well as broad, and I am Exhibit A of that fact. Fishkin, one of America's leading scholars on Mark Twain, credited USCET for transforming her life as a scholar. Before USCET took her to China in 2004, she had never been to China, never met a Chinese colleague in her field, and never published work focused on China. Attending early USCET conferences, she got hooked by the first one and went to a second one at Yunnan University. She said they changed her mental map, quote unquote, and redirected her research agenda in, quote unquote, profound ways. setting in motion collaborations and publications that might never have happened otherwise. From those seeds grew major initiatives that have reshaped the field, with the publication of the Journal of Transnational American Studies, the massive Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project at Stanford, and dozens of articles, edited volumes, and international collaborations. In her words, USCET introduced her, and I would add by extension, hundreds of others, to the idea that connecting with colleagues across the Pacific could transform scholarship itself. Shelley Fisher Fishkin's story is, for me, a vivid reminder of my mantra that while government to government relations may rise and fall, people to people exchange endures and continues to shape U.S. China relations in lasting ways. End of story.
Thank you for that, Julia. Testimonies from the participants, of course, are always very powerful. But thank you for that. I wanted to bring up a few questions that came in from the audience. And one of them is asking about the kinds of resources that USCET brings to schools, including at the middle school level, if there are any. Do you offer resources for schools in the US to prepare American students before they go to China? And I suppose I might as well ask at the same time in reverse, resources to schools in China to prepare their students before they come to the United States so that they have some kind of preparation or groundwork before they actually physically fly to the other place to engage in person.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think I can also tie this to another question that I saw came in the chat about the numbers of American students going to China writ large. The latest figures we have from the U.S. Embassy in Beijing is it's just around 1,000, just over 1,000 Americans who are studying in China at the moment. That's for kind of either a semester-long program or longer. So that's not just a kind of a short-term 1-week visitor, but the people who are there for a longer period of study. And we don't prepare, we mostly work on higher ed, so not at the middle school level. But a project we are just getting started is providing a resource hub for Americans who are interested in academic travel to China. So this is a project that would bring together the kind of expertise and what we've learned in the post-COVID world about academic travel in China, everything from the opportunities that still exist, which are much more limited than before, but there are still pathways to get there. Language programs that are still running, programs like Schwarzman and Yanqing and NYU Shanghai that continue to welcome American students, inventorying kind of what options are still available for students who want to go, but then also providing the resources to answer the questions that we see as preventing a lot of interest, or maybe not preventing interest, but do serve as a barrier to get more Americans there, because there hasn't been a flow of Americans. So a lot of university students in particular who might have studied Chinese in school, gone on their university-run study abroad program, and that would have taken them to a campus or a program within a major hub in China. A lot of that infrastructure has not returned since the pandemic, and we see USCET's role as being able to provide some of the resources to help to provide information for those who do want to return, how to do so safely and successfully. And some of that does get to the question that was raised by Elizabeth, propaganda, censorship, and surveillance. The reality is that, there are a lot of challenges in China. And if, you've spent time there, you understand the tech ecosystem, the safety and security concerns, and other things like that. If you're a first-time traveler, that might not be, you don't know where to get your information. It's confusing, and you hear a lot in the news. You hear a lot of information on extremes on both sides, reporting that it's extremely dangerous and challenging to travel in China. News from the Chinese state media side that everything is great and there's nothing to worry about. And so we want to try to provide something that's vetted based on experience and ideally crowdsourced, so we can get the voices of people who've been to China recently for academic programs into the mix, and they can help to provide resources for those who are coming after them.
So this is
I would just
something new
add
that
one
you're working
practical
on?
point.
Yeah, so this is a new project that we are just scoping now, but we're hoping to get launched.
Okay.
So
maybe we could see some things start to come forth and be available in the coming year.
Exactly. So we've we're just starting up.
That sounds great.
Catherine, I wanted to add a point. we have long recognized the need for orientations for Americans going to China and for Chinese coming to America. We applied several times in the history of USCET for grants to do this, and we never succeeded. So that's a very practical point. And we hope that through this new project, the working group, we hope that we can maybe begin in a small way to address these problems.
Yeah. So I just wanted to maybe sum up a little bit the argument that I think I'm hearing, the response that you would make to the critics on either side, those who are suspicious, of the students who are going in both directions, is to say that, well, for sure, there may be some individual students who travel in either direction with some other agenda of, that is, not positive. It is not just about learning, might be engaging in some kind of spying or whatever, but that these would be very few, and that the benefits from these exchanges are so many more times greater than these isolated individual cases, that we would be harming ourselves, and similarly to China, they would be harming themselves if they were to cut it off. It seems to be the argument that I hear you making, and I'm wondering, have you had opportunities to present these arguments to officials on either side, who the ones who actually, kind of control the doors, I guess, or, make it possible or have the power to make it impossible. Those, for example, in the State Department or the Foreign Ministry in China, who issue the visas or license the programs or approve the exchanges. And have you found advocates in either of those spaces? Are there voices in Washington from Congress or their congressional staffer teams, or at the State Department? Are there still voices who are saying to you, yes, we agree, we understand, because we also have seen that the vast majority have these positive effects?
Catherine, I think I would answer it this way. Look at the facts. I would tell the people, don't just base your thoughts and your convictions on hearsay. And unfortunately, there are just too few facts. However, that is one of the main reasons why Madeline Ross, when she was president of USCET, she started this China student survey, which with cooperation from San Diego, University of California, San Diego.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So let me just share with you, because I'm looking at the time, that the overall results, and I think it would be reassuring for Americans worried about the presence of students from China. The survey's results showed a group making their own decisions to study in America, meaning the Chinese students make their own decisions. Only 2% of the time period and the students surveyed, only 2% had government sponsorship or government funding. That's 2% only. And by the way, there have been 3 million Chinese who have studied in China in America since the 1970s. And out of all that, government funding has decreased consistently of this study abroad for Chinese students. And the survey results went on to say that they came largely financed by family and universities. Despite some feelings of alienation and negative political or racial encounters on campus, most respondents report that they took away fond memories and enduring friendships, and many have chosen to stay in touch with their university. Now, we shared the report, we distributed it among our audiences, our partners and counterparts, but whether they reached the policymakers, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. And I'll just chime in. I do think that there's a few different constituencies that have come together here at various points, given the politics. One is subnational and local governments. Chinese students are an enormous revenue generator for America, with added benefits to us as well. So the U.S. China Business Council's export report in 2025 notes that $14.4 billion, the largest service export from the United States, was education. And that isn't just in the major cities like New York and, LA. This is all throughout the country, including, Bloomington, Indiana, and different places throughout the country see the benefits of both, student enrollment and the tuition dollars, but rent, car, family visits, airplane tickets, food, living costs, right? Everything else that adds up and it contributes enormously to the US economy, and creates jobs as well. And so there's, I think, a constituency that really does see the benefit of, if nothing else, than for economic terms of Chinese students studying here. But I think also in my own interactions with folks at places like the FBI or the Department of Defense, who I think we would maybe cast as traditionally more hawkish or anti-China, quote unquote. I think there's a lot of understanding of the texture and nuance that not all Chinese students are the same, and that blanket policies that restrict folks based on country of origin or, you know, very broad, whatever discipline you're studying, regardless of what exactly you're doing. These kinds of restrictions are just not only too broad to, be useful, but they're actually really hard to enforce. If you have to have FBI resources looking at every student studying STEM who comes from Chinese point of origin, it's a lot to ask of our country to do. And is in the end, the question comes, is this actually useful? And is this the right type of strategy to understand, who people are and what their profile is and if there's any risk associated with them. And so and the other piece is that the United States is deeply dependent on immigrant tech labor force in our own critical technologies. And so there's another constituency there that I think is has been seen on the right as well. And this conversation about visa statuses and welcoming immigration and, AI talent in the future that really sees a benefit to getting top students from around the world in critical technologies, China included, to come to the United States and stay and, staple a green card to their, PhD or whatever, that saying is, and really continue to have the US be a hub for international resource, and like brain drain from other places to benefit our own end. So to your question of kind of who is the constituency for this and how are the policymakers reacting to this, I think there's a lot of different motivations, but it kind of there is a kind of an odd group of bedfellows that do see agreement that there is a deep incentive for the United States to have Chinese talent still come here.
Yeah, you were just mentioning the business side and where the students go. I was looking last night at the Institute for International Education page because they do an annual, or they call it open door report on all international students coming to the United States. They also look at American students going abroad to study. They don't yet have up their numbers for the 24-25 academic year. There's always quite a lag because I think it takes a long time to collect the data. But they mentioned that of the receiving states for Chinese students, Texas is actually the third largest. So it's California and New York, I think in that order, but then I was struck that it is Texas. And as you say, of course, then you have Indiana and Illinois and so on. So it's quite broad. There are red states as well as blue. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what has happened since May, if you know, to the extent you do. So it was in May that the U.S. State Department issued a rather short and it was no detailed statement about a plan to, quote, aggressively revoke the visas of Chinese students. And it wasn't clear what that meant, of all Chinese students or of targeted Chinese students, or was the plan to just sort of review their status and so on. It wasn't clear. I have been watching and haven't seen any kind of reports about Chinese students having, in any significant numbers, had their visas revoked. I'm wondering what you heard about that, in fact, happening. But also, I bring it up because I think it was a day or two after the statement came out, your organization, USCET, put out a statement in response in which you expressed disappointment with this State Department move and and made a little bit of an argument for, you said USCET is troubled by the statement and that it threatened the broader foundation of U.S.-China relations and fails to distinguish between individuals who pose genuine risks and those simply seeking educational opportunities, which is the argument you've made as well. So in addition to asking what you've seen actually happening since May, could you talk a little bit about the thought that went into issuing this statement and what kind of response you've received, if any?
Why don't I start and let Rosie finish? That's how it works because she's the present right now. Anyway, I would say that USCET rarely, if ever, issues public statements.
Yeah.
We see our role as educational, not political. But this case was, to us, extreme. The State Department's plan to aggressively revoke student visa really struck at the heart of our mission. What worried us most was that systematically excluding Chinese students from studying here based on the fact that they're Chinese, and that's all, was really self-defeating. We risk creating a generation of Chinese leaders and intellectuals with little firsthand knowledge of America. Leaders more likely to misjudge U.S. intentions, less likely to value cooperation, and more inclined to see the U.S. as hostile, as wanting to really repress, contain China. What is meant to be a security measure to protect Americans would actually make America less secure, less competitive, and less connected to the very people whose understanding of the U.S. matters the most. That drove us to issue a statement, and Rosie really got that done quickly and on time. So, Rosie, tell them about what happened.
Well, I mean, I think precisely as you outlined, it's although we don't work in the industry of bringing Chinese students here, it is so fundamental to what we do that there are pathways on both sides for students to travel. They don't need to be kind of, run or organized by us. We're a small outfit, as Julia mentioned. We don't have the capacity to bring, students in large numbers, but the pathways, they need to exist for our work to be effective. And if people can't travel, and if they can't travel freely, and they can't, get those opportunities to be exposed to both sides, then there really isn't an education exchange to speak of, right? And so for us, I think that that statement really kind of struck to the core of what we think is valuable in this endeavor, which is finding those pathways that do exist to get students here and to get Chinese students here and Americans going there. And just to your point, Catherine, on the question of whether or not this is like what's happening now, honestly, I think there's still a lot of confusion. I've heard anecdotally that students have been turned away when they've sought visa appointments in Beijing, Shanghai, and even Hong Kong on very unclear criteria. There's all sorts of overlapping issues now facing Chinese students who seek to enroll here. It's the social media reviews, the Chinese, what we mentioned, the aggressively revoking Chinese visas specifically, not just international students. There's on the U.S. side, institutions losing access to host Chinese students, and so there's a lot of confusion and uncertainty facing students who do seek to come here, and it's particularly challenging for students who've already enrolled. They're 3 years into their program, and I've heard anecdotally folks saying that they're not going to leave. They just want to stay in the United States for the next year, unbroken for whatever reason, unless something horrible happens at home, because they don't want to run the risk of being denied reentry when they come back. And so I think that's what we find troubling as well. It's really punishing the wrong people. It's taking students who've, of all the choices they have available to them, have chosen to come to the United States or are getting exposure to America, paying tuition, fueling our economy, all these wonderful, all these benefits to us. And they're living in these pretty, I think, traumatic conditions, trying to understand how these new regulations are going to impact them in their trajectory and future. And so you mentioned the IIE numbers and the open doors figures that do come woefully late. It's really hard to understand. It's hard to get a picture of today and the snapshot of what policies in May have triggered or kind of led to in September, because we don't have the figures yet. But I would not be surprised if we see a pretty big dip in enrollments for this fall, given all this uncertainty that's weighing on the minds of students and their parents as they think about how to make good decisions for their own future.
I know that the Chronicle of Higher Education has a wonderful newsletter, which I'm happy to promote for them. It's called Latitudes. And the author of that newsletter, which is weekly, does a lot of journalistic reporting and outreach with different actors to try to take the pulse on a more ongoing basis, not just waiting for the big open door survey to come. And what I've been seeing in her newsletter this year so far has been that a lot of American universities are still having the Chinese students, but also other foreign students sort of trickle onto campus. So this in particular, meaning that the incoming ones, the newly arriving ones who have had to go through the new visa application process, are sort of trickling on, coming late, and therefore a lot of universities have been unsure, even now as we're in September, unsure about exactly how many are ultimately going to be able to show up. And so I think that's definitely going to delay the big, the numbers that we're all hungering to see, what is the actual impact been. But again, I haven't been seeing the same anecdotal. There was something that the foreign ministry had issued, the Chinese foreign ministry issued a statement within the last month condemning some of the American responses to their students coming and then being, taken into a separate space for questioning and maybe rejected. But there were no numbers offered from their side as to what they're seeing in terms of students actually being turned away at the border. And again, I haven't been seeing anything about actual revocations of already outstanding visas. And so we are left wondering, what's going on, how much impact is this initiative having? The statement that you put out, did you get much comment or response back from either government agencies or actors, or just the private sector for your statement?
Well, I think we've had mostly positive response. And I can't cite anything specific, but I will say, like, just to the broader confusion point, I mean, even in the past, I think it was last week, President Trump himself said that the United States is welcoming double the amount of Chinese students in the United States. And it seems like this is being at least tangentially tied to the economic discussions happening between the US and China and trade talks. And so, it's, in terms of reaction, it's like, it's hard to even know what the picture is to know what the reaction looks like. I think it does seem like this issue is shifting quite rapidly, and it hasn't quite settled yet on how this administration is going to approach the question of Chinese students. Clearly, there's a lot of confusion, and I don't think that any side, the Chinese side or the United States, is currently happy with the, conflicting information and students then being in the crosshairs. But I do wonder if we might get a more clear picture after whatever senior leader meeting or economic talks come together, and if this might be tied to it. So I think we've had mostly positive response to our statement in particular, but nothing particular to note, I don't think.
So I'm just looking at the questions, and I do welcome in the time we have remaining for audience members to post questions. One, I'm not sure if you can answer, is asking if you can comment on the major US programs, education programs in China, and how they're faring. There are a number of major exchanges of longstanding. There's the Hopkins Nanjing program, brings American study, and at least at one point, I were to live with in dormitories with Chinese students, the Hopkins Nanjing. And then there's, of course, our own NYU Shanghai program. Duke has a program in China, and there are others. Do either of you have any information about how they're faring now, or anything you want to say about it? Or
Yeah.
Well, NYU should be very happy. We visited when we were last in China, at NYU Shanghai. It is thriving, and they're active. They have a waiting list, et cetera, et cetera. They have a beautiful building. I'm not sure that I can say the same for others. And Rosie is very, very close to the Schwartzman program, which of course is still standing and doing quite well. But Rosie, tell them about the others.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think it's an interesting predicament where I think actually the US programs, these joint venture institutions are doing very well because there is a lot of interest in China among the next generation of Americans. And I know that was one of the questions you wanted to get to, Catherine, is kind of how the youngest generation, the upcoming rising generation is looking at some of these questions. And from where I sit, especially in Washington, D.C., I see massive interest in China, a deep desire to understand what's going on there, whether it's for, professional opportunities in the government working on China or just a curiosity of a place that they've read a lot of news about and want to better understand. And so my sense is that these programs are actually indeed doing quite well on the ground and continue to see robust interest. Hopkins Nanjing Center, I've just heard, is going to be launching a English language program for the first time. Their program has historically been you have to have at least an intermediate level of Chinese to even enroll, and then you have your coursework in Chinese, but they'll offer a pathway for English language study. So that will also broaden the aperture. And programs like Schwarzman and Yenching continue to have a high level of enrollment, and I think turn away more students than they can take because there is an interest in going. But with that caveat, Americans, I think, increasingly want to go on American organized programs and American funded programs because there are concerns around whether if you take funding from the Chinese or if you go on a direct enrollment to somewhere like Tsinghua University or Beida, if that might impact your future career prospects, which is really a shame because I think that had been a really important way for students to go to China in the past was really just to not be through mediated through an American provider, an American institution, but really, engage with the campus firsthand, and you learn a lot of different things that way. And so I think there is an increase in some ways, but also a lot more operational contributors and you know con-
So yeah, could you talk briefly about the how your generation and even those younger than you, because you're not just out of school, you've been in the workforce for a while now, those who are in school now, um, how they see China. I myself, of course, see it in the lens of someone who was growing up in the 70s, and I began studying the Chinese language before we had bilateral relations. I wasn't really sure if I was ever going to be able to speak to an actual Chinese person in Chinese when I began. So I have one perspective that is very much shaped by the historical context of my day. What's the historical, given the context that we were just talking about, what is the conclusion that you're seeing the up and coming scholars having towards China, and what is the basis of their interest?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really good question. And of course, the generation that's coming up now has a number of different views. I do consider myself a little bit on the cusp because I was able to spend a lot of time there freely. I arrived in China and I worked different jobs. I went around, I traveled, I did all sorts of different things, and I got a really robust sense of the country from that experience. And frankly, that's not the norm for most Americans who go now. If they've been at all to China, it's through an enrolled program where their time and their experience is much more constrained. But what does give me hope is that I think there's, of course, an interest in security. The dynamic of the relationship is much more characterized by security, and that drives interest as well. But I'm really inspired by the eagerness to understand, and I think there is a lot of genuine curiosity that actually maybe echoes the time in the 1970s where there is a separation. A lot of Americans have not been to China, don't know anyone who's been there. They meet Chinese here in the United States, but I think it feeds this interest in kind of understanding firsthand what's going on over there because it is different than what they've been exposed to. And so, especially on issues like climate change and technology development, high-speed rail, global health, some of these questions that I think China has really carved out a space for itself and our global challenges. I see a lot of curiosity among the rising generation in better understanding these issues. Um, I think that gives me a lot of confidence in our work that we can continue to make pathways possible, and we won't sugarcoat it and say it's going to be easy or that everything in China is, wonderful and fantastic. But I do think that that desire to understand is still there, and that gives me a lot of hope.
Can you talk maybe, there's an organization that I find quite interesting called Young China Watchers.
Mhm.
Um, and that seems to function as a kind of a platform and a water cooler for people who are trying to start off on China-focused careers. How does that work?
Yeah, so I've been involved with Young China Watchers for a while now. I don't know if I'm young anymore, but I do consider myself still involved.
Well, you know the old jokes about the Chinese Youth League.
Yeah.
The, being led by people in their 40s and 50s.
Right, that's going to be me with Young China Watchers. But it's a really interesting. It's an informal network. We don't have a membership. There's no fees. It's all volunteer. There's chapters globally, including in China, and throughout the United States and Europe. And it's such a diverse group of folks who have found an interest in the field. Most who have lived and worked and studied in China, which I think is a pretty interesting dynamic. And that community, I think. Um, has found itself. It's a group of people who do have that experience and want to better, you know, use it and want to stay in the field. They want to have jobs. They want to continue to use their language skills that they've developed in their time in country. But I will say, I think the challenge facing many of them is that the career pathways are extremely narrow and even more narrow with lack of federal funding and a lot of layoffs at places like the State Department and other agencies that would traditionally hire China hands. So I think there's still robust interest and desire to work on this field and better understand this place that is extremely confusing, and we need all the great minds we can to better understand China. But the career options right now, I think, are quite depressing. So that's one acute challenge that I see.
When you say the career options depressing and cut off of federal funding, are you referring to the federal funding for nonprofits
Yeah.
that had been channeled? So it had come through USAID sometimes, or else through the State Department, going to organizations that were doing various kinds of, NGO exchanges with China.
Yeah, precisely. And so if the funding spigot closes, and also university funding for that matter too, so university affiliated think tanks and research centers that would traditionally hire research associates or junior scholars, things like this, if the funding environment is just tighter overall, those positions tend to go. So the civil society space is constrained, academia is constrained, and then of course the foreign service exam is not being run, and some of these other pathways for government roles are not hiring right now either. So yeah, it's a very kind of narrowed job market, I think, for China scholars right now.
In the 60 seconds, I guess we have less, do you have any tips or recommendations for how someone who is currently in school thinking about this, what would you recommend they do?
Well, I think they should do what they think is the most interesting to them and not worry about these questions of security clearance and other things like that. I think I hear a lot of young people today really worried that like if I do this now, I'm not sure if I'm going to get cleared then. And I think that logic is extremely challenging. I think you got to just take the opportunities in front of you, whether that's going abroad, maybe spending time in Taiwan or in China, doing something different, getting out of DC, that could help. And taking these opportunities to get more firsthand exposure if they can. And if not, then maybe join Young China Watchers and find a community who can help support you as well. And follow USCET's works because we're focusing on this as well as we want to think about the pipeline of American expertise on China and ensure they're there.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you both so much, Julia and Rosie, for joining this conversation. I think this is a topic that has drawn, as I can see from who is on in the audience today and has stayed throughout, has a very dedicated core of people who want to see some way of ensuring that these kinds of exchanges of all sorts, whatever flavor, going to China, Chinese coming here, etc., that it can continue and be a thread of continuity, even as the governments negotiate and whether it's tariffs or trade technology, etc., that the education exchanges can at least be a point of stability in the relationship, regardless of what happens. And so I think this is, if Young China Watchers is one kind of a community, this education participants P2P is another kind of community that has come to some extent together without having formal meetings or a catchy name. That we should periodically touch base with each other and find out how organizations are faring. So thank you both for giving your time on this early morning, and thank you all in the audience for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine, and thanks to your colleagues for organizing this. It was great to see many familiar names on the invite list, and it was a really great discussion.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm still cautiously optimistic.
Right. We all hold to that old standby. Okay, and with that, we'll end our program. Bye-bye. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.